Good evening and welcome. I'm Betsy Dewitt, president of the Brookline League of Women Voters, and we welcome all who are participating with us now remotely and in all who will see the recorded video on BIG, B-I-G, our local cable TV company. First, I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming events. The annual League of Women Voters Day on the Hill, meeting with our Massachusetts legislators, will be online on Wednesday, October 27th from 10 a.m. until noon. To register, League members must go to the League of Women Voters Massachusetts website, where there is a link to the event. And I will say, having attended these over the years, it's usually informative, although I've never done one remotely, so it'll be an interesting experience. Also, beginning on October 15th, the League, co-sponsored with the Town Meeting Members Association, will be offering a series of online Friday morning warrant article forums that discuss items before the November town meeting. The next one is scheduled for Friday, October 29th, and we'll be talking about Articles 10, 11, 12, and 13, all of which affect use of remote public meetings and the Massachusetts Open Meeting Law. Tonight, we begin a series intended to discuss local Brookline history and government, with future topics on types of municipal government and how they compare to Brookline. For example, Brookline was the first to adopt representative town meeting in 1915. Long before the Massachusetts Constitution was amended to create charters in 1966. So, what is the impact of having no charter? We will address this and other aspects of local government over the coming months. We hope we can learn from the past as we plan for the future. Now, I will ask League Board Member Catherine Florio to provide an overview of the series of planned civic education programs. And Catherine, you are now allowed to unmute and share your screen.
Thank you, Betsy. And hello, everybody. At our closing meeting last June, you, our membership, directed us to study forms of local government. We accepted and created a working group. The first of the programs was held on September 13th. Mel Kleckner, our town administrator, gave us an exceptionally informative answer to the question, why is it important for the town of Brookline to have a charter? Our topic is representative town meeting and other forms of local government. Our intention is programming that shares this knowledge, and our audience is the Brookline League of Women Voters members and Brookline residents. We hope long-term that the benefits of this work will lead to a broader overview to the charter process if the town chooses that direction. A common vocabulary that will lead to increased trust and better understanding of our common ground. Increasing the participation in Brookline government as it is now, and hopefully increasing the transparency of the workings of the town. We hope all this will lead to a wider experience of representation and inclusion in the Brookline town government. I'd like to take a moment to thank our working group, Ernie Fry, Janice Kahn, and Shanna Penna. We look forward to our upcoming programming. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Catherine. Now we will move on and hear from our first presenter. Ken Liss is president of the Brookline Historical Society and retired head of instructional services for the Boston University Libraries. He is leading a series of walking tours around Brookline neighborhoods, and the next one will be on October 24th at 2 p.m., leaving from Brookline High School. And I believe at the Historical Society, there are more details about how these tours are operating. And We will also be hearing from Greer Hardwicke, who was the town preservation planner, administrator, and historian for 30 years. She is the co-author or editor of many publications about Brookline and is working on a history of women in Brookline. So how long after women got the right to vote before there was a woman elected to the Board of Selectmen, huh? Anyway, we'll hear more and learn more. And for your information, there will be time for questions. Please put questions in the chat. You should be able to see the link, which is a little sort of thing with its thumb down at the bottom of the screen that just has the word chat in it. And now, Ken Liss, you may have the floor and you may share your screen.
Thank you, Betsy. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a moment. Okay. So when Betsy asked Greer and me to put together some talks and slideshows on the history of town government, I did as I typically do when I'm asked a question, try to find out more than I already know. And while I've spent a lot of time looking through official Brookline records, Brookline newspapers, and many other sources of information about the town, there was a lot that I had to learn about the history of Brookline's town government with an eye toward how understanding the history of the town and its government over more than 300 years can help us as we think about what the future of the Brookline town government should be. So I'm going to share a lot of what I did, starting even before Brookline was a town, through the process of Brookline becoming independent in 1705, independent from Boston, through the change in government to, as Betsy said in the introductory remarks, to become the first town in Massachusetts to change from open town meeting to representative town meeting, through the suffrage movement, which Betsy will talk about, which Greer will talk about in much more detail, and through other changes as the town has grown and the government has grown and changed, taking us to the present and current discussions about what the future of Brookline government should be. Going back to long before Brookline was Brookline, it was an area known as Muddy River. It was a part of Boston. It was mentioned in 1634 in the book Boston Town Records, where there were a number of things talked about covering Boston proper. One of the lines there was about putting charges, a rate for the young cattle and cows keeper at Muddy River. Now, I'm not sure whether that means the cows keeper was young or the cows were young, but in any case, back in 1634, they were talking about how to pay somebody to take care of the cattle and cows in Muddy River, which later became Brookline because it was pasture land. It was a place where people could graze their cows and their sheep and other animals. In 1635, there was a distribution of land to 5 people in Muddy River. And a couple of years later, there came what was known as the Great Allotment. And this is just a sample of the many, more than 50 people who were given land in the area known as Muddy River. And this map that was prepared for the Brookline Historical Society in 1923, obviously much later, shows the division of land to more than 50 people in the hamlet of Muddy River, a part of Boston. It should be noted that at this time, as in many parts of what became the United States and the New World, there were, of course, already people here. John Winthrop, Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts, in his journal in 1632, wrote notice being given of 10 sagamores and many Indians assembled at Muddy River. The governor sent Captain Underhill with 20 musketeers to discover, etc. But at Roxbury, they heard they were broke up. So by the time they, even before they got to what was Muddy River, the indigenous people who had been spotted there were gone. Later information emerged. We don't know a lot about the native presence in what became Brookline, but the two purple stars on this contemporary map, one at the top is near to what is now Amory Park. And in the 19th century, there were reports of the ruins of a Native American fort at that area. And the lower star near Chestnut Hill Avenue also talks about a settlement. So we do know that there were Native Americans here. Given that, the many people who were given allotments of land in Muddy River, part of Boston, nonetheless, although it wasn't an independent town, there was governance going on. And some of the records from Boston from that pre-Brookline independence period give an indication of how even this settlement used mostly for pasture land needed some government. So in 1640, they talked about appointing overseers of the fence. So if people are grazing their animals, how do you make sure that your animals are not interfering with other people's animals? So fences were put up, and there were people appointed to manage that. In 1651, they talked about viewing the lands for laying out a highway. So obviously not a highway in the sense that we think of it today, but highway in the literal term as a road that was higher. So out of the mud and laying out roads. So officials were laying out roads through Muddy River. And in 1668, there are people doing surveying. One of my favorite words in there, the perambulation from Muddy River, Cambridge and Roxbury. Perambulation being walking around, something I do a lot of, and love the word as well as the activity. In 1680, still part of Boston, there were records in the Boston records for a constable, 2 surveyors, and tithing men, basically collecting taxes from the people who were inhabiting Muddy River. In 1695, a constable, surveyors, tithing men, fence viewers, and bounds. So governance going on at this time, this early time when Muddy River, later Brookline, was still a part of Boston. In 1686, Muddy River was given not exactly independence, but in this records from the Boston records of 1686, handwritten originally, they were typed up much later, and I've highlighted in color some of the steps that were taken to give Brookline a degree of independence. So the hamlet of Muddy River to be free from town rates to the town of Boston. So no longer paying taxes to Boston, maintaining their own highways and poor and other public charges. Raise a schoolhouse, maintain an able reading and writing master, and from and after this day that the inhabitants annually meet to choose 3 men to manage their affairs. So still not an independent town, but a degree of self-government more than had been done before in 1686. In 1700, the inhabitants of Muddy River petitioned to be separated from Boston and become an independent town, giving several reasons: that they were remote from Boston to enjoy the schools and relief of the poor, repair the highways that took place in Boston proper. And this was denied. Not only was it denied, but they said that they were going to start having people in Muddy River pay taxes to Boston again. So didn't take much longer until after that. 1705, November 16th, the hamlet of Muddy River became the town of Brookline. And this is when Brookline became independent. So 316 years ago this November. The first town meeting took place a year later. And you can see some of the highlighted things from 1706 indicating that there were now more officials. So at the town meeting was voted to choose 5 selectmen, a town clerk, assessors, tithing men, surveyors of highways, fence viewers, and overseers of the common lands, and field drivers for the year. So already a growth in a government as Brookline became an independent town, as well as voted that there should be a burying place in the town and building a meeting house. This is 1706. 6 years later, 3 men were chosen to find the center or middle of the town and a convenient place to build a meeting house. And not much separation of church and state those days. So the meeting house was both the civic meeting house and the religious meeting house. And so this is 1706, the first town meeting, 1712, the move toward a meeting house, which was built in 1717. And that was good enough. That was enough for this small farming community to govern. In 1800, the population of Brookline was 605 people. In 1820, it was 900 people. So it's a very small population, and the form of town meeting government that was set up in 1705 was adequate. But things started to change. And one of the changes was in the 1840s when the railroad came to Brookline. It came to what is now the Brookline Village station on the D line, and it connected to Boston, ran up what is now Brookline Avenue, and provided more transportation, more access to Boston. And that was one of the factors that led to the growth of the town of Brookline, now 130 some odd years old. In 1850 and 1851, Beacon Street was laid out. It came across the back bay on the Mill Dam and across North Brookline. It was not the Beacon Street that we know today. And it was a narrow country lane. You can see a couple of pictures of it. The picture on the lower left is looking towards Coolidge Corner. So you can see it's a lot of open land. As late as 1874, there were only 24 buildings along the length of Beacon Street from what's today Kenmore Square to what is today Cleveland Circle. And all of those buildings were residences, except the building in the lower right, which was at the corner of Beacon Street and Harvard Street, and was the Coolidge and Brothers store, which gave its name to the corner of Coolidge's Corner, later became Coolidge Corner. So this access across the Mill Dam and the road led to more growth in North Brookline and more changes for the town. Finally, in the 1880s, came the modern development of Beacon Street with Frederick Law Olmsted and Henry Whitney turning this 50-foot wide country lane into a 160-foot wide boulevard with electric trolleys running down the center, providing easier access to Boston, leading to even more growth. So this hamlet of Muddy River that became the town of Brookline and that remained for many years an agricultural community has really started to change. And perhaps even more illustrative of the change, the need for rethinking the way the town was governed was this chart that I put together showing the growth in both population and expenditures for the town. So in 1850, there were 2,500 people and the town budget was $13,000. It grew steadily through the latter half of the 19th century. And by 1900, there were 20,000 people living in Brookline and the budget was over $1 million. So that's quite a change from what Brookline was. And people started to think about how this could require a change in the way that the town was governed. One of the changes that was already taking place was where the town was governed. So in 1717, the first building of First Parish Church was built. The current First Parish is the fourth building. And for over 100 years, that was where town meeting took place. That's where everything took place until 1822, when the building on the upper right, now known as Pierce Hall and attached to First Parish, was built as the town hall. So that was the first building built as a town hall. In 1844, just before the railroad came to Brookline Village, the building on the lower left was built, the first town hall in the area where municipal government is today. This was on Holden Street, and it's facing Harvard Street is over to Washington Street is over to the left. It's not in the picture. And in 1873, the Victorian Town Hall at Lower Right was built. So a lot of change, and all of this was to accommodate a need for change in the way the town was governed. 1873 was also when a very important event took place, which was the vote whether or not to have Brookline annexed to Boston. You can see in the map on the left that Roxbury and Dorchester had already been annexed to Boston in 1868 and 1870. They had been independent cities and towns. And in 1873, Charlestown, Brighton, and West Roxbury all voted to join Boston, to be annexed to Boston. The annexation didn't take place until the following year, and Brookline voted no. Brookline voted to remain an independent town. And the image in the middle from the Boston transcript has these dueling annexation rallies in Town Hall, both taking place in Town Hall at the same time on the same day, one in the upper hall and one in the lower hall. That must have been how they decided who got the upper hall and who got the lower hall, I don't know. But you've got the anti-annexation vote at the bottom and union with on the top and union with Boston on the bottom. That was on October 6th, the day before the election. And on October 8th, the Boston Globe reported results of yesterday's voting. Charlestown, Brighton, and West Roxbury annexed to Boston. Brookline retains its identity. So Brookline stayed an independent town. It was a wealthy town, and the reasons for Brookline choosing to remain independent, I won't go into all of that here, but it was, as is always the case in Brookline, there was a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. Not long after, this man, Alfred D Chandler, became the driving force behind changes in Brookline's town government. This article that he wrote in 1893 in the New England Magazine was a study in town government. And he studied town government. He wrote extensively about town government, how it worked, and how it should work. And he began pushing for what came to be known, well, he called it initially a town council, later to be known as representative town government. And it was greatly debated. Here are articles from one of the Brookline newspapers of the day, the Suburban, in November of 1899, a big meeting, the town meeting and its lessons. There are two smaller articles on the right by about Chandler's proposal, and then a correspondent asks several pertinent questions and invites answers. So the ideas that Chandler was proposing for a change in town government, where it would be an elected town meeting members instead of an open town meeting where all voters could attend town meeting and vote. And he was proposing that there should be a representative town meeting where a body would be elected, as it is now, and would make the decisions. This continued to be debated. Here's the next 2 weeks in the Suburban, Brookline Town Council, of what shall it be constituted, Brookline Town Council, how shall it be chosen? So that's what they were calling it at the time, the Town Council. But Chandler later started referring to it as representative town government instead of open, representative town meeting instead of open town meeting. So I'm going to read to you some quotes, both for and against. And you'll get a sense of how Brookline debated this and what kind of things they were thinking about. The arguments for limited town meeting. The elasticity and efficiency of the New England town meeting system can, when towns reach a certain size, still be successfully operated under a limited form after a large town has outgrown the unlimited form of town meeting. The Brookline Town Hall, with the turnstiles of its assembly, admits only about 20% of the voters, that is about 1,000, when meeting for deliberation and appropriations. The other 80%, or about 4,000, are deprived of their legal right to vote. So town meeting then was held in the 1873 town hall. It could hold 20% of the voters, and others just couldn't get in. This simple plan prevents the packing of town meetings. That was one of the concerns, that with limited numbers being able to get in, that people who wanted to vote to go a certain way can make sure to get their folks there early and on time to influence the vote. So the packing of town meetings by special interests, this simple plan prevents, cures the present injustice of taxation without representation, assists progress, encourages prudence, and does not otherwise interfere with the established modes of municipal procedure and administration. The arguments against the limited town meeting: Mr. Chandler's plan of a modified town meeting destroys a voter's power in the management of affairs the moment the council is elected. In America, where city councils have been unsuccessful, a modified city government is not a popular or winning title, but it is the proper title for Mr. Chandler's scheme. I do not believe that Brookline is yet so overgrown that its citizens are now called upon to vote away their rights to manage the town's affairs in their own way. And the establishment of a town council of representatives to take final action on all matters violates the very essence of town government, for it destroys the direct, immediate right of citizens to speak and vote for themselves. So the arguments kind of broke down the arguments for limited government for efficiency and for more people with the size of the hall, more people being able to have a say in, even if in an indirect way, while the arguments against it really didn't want to lose that direct ability to influence government. That's kind of more direct democracy. So this was in 1899. In December of 1899, it was reported in the Boston Transcript that Brookline would appoint a special committee of 25 to consider a town council, something that's still a common practice in Brookline, appoint a committee to study things. In January 6th, a meeting was held, and oddly, I'm very curious about this, that the only one to speak in favor of the town council, the representative town government, was Alfred Chandler. Nobody else showed up to talk about it, and nothing happened. So Brookline continued operating in the way it had operated more or less since 1705. However, in 1906, the city of Newport, Rhode Island, which was a city, decided to change its form of government and become a town again, to go back to a town government and to use the model with some modification that Alfred Chandler had proposed. So they used the work he had done, they used his writings, and they reverted to being a town, but with a town council. Rhode Island was different than Massachusetts, so not everything was exactly the way that Chandler had envisioned it, but it clearly was based on his model. And in fact, after this was adopted, the Brookline Chronicle proudly said, "Imitation the sincerest flattery." So imitation not of what Brookline had done, because Brookline had not done it, but what Alfred Chandler in Brookline had proposed. Chandler wrote in the Boston Transcript about Newport's new charter. He wrote in the Brookline Chronicle about what Newport had done, and he continued to press for this new form of government. But it took a while. Until 1915. In March, it was reported that Brookline may ask for changes in the town's government. The town was interested. It will be voted on at the next meeting. And finally, on November 3rd, 1915, 210 years after Brookline became a town, Brookline adopts new government, limited town meeting, the rule hereafter. You'll notice that suffrage was beaten by a 2-to-1 vote at the same time. I'm sure Greer will tell us lots more about that. The Brookline Chronicle reported on the last Brookline town meeting, and limited town meeting comes to Brookline. They say the old system was characterized by small attendance, intelligent debate, a degree of timidity, an inclination to temporize, and solutions in the main conservative. The greater stability and strength of the limited town meeting will be of help in such matters. With passing of the old chance, they'll become strengthening. And I love this last paragraph. The members are likely to feel under greater obligation to give continuous and searching consideration to pressing local questions, and there should be fewer instances of halting and temporizing procedure. motions to recommit or to postpone, it is to be hoped will be less frequent under the new system than the old. I'm not sure that that actually came to pass. Continued growth. By 1940, the population was 50,000 and the budget was over 5 million. The town government structure had grown considerably. And in that year, in 1940, Brookline hired an organization out of Chicago called Public Administration Services to look at Brookline government. How well does it work? And just by the table of contents, you can see that it was fairly complicated and there was a lot to be done. And they said that the town meeting is a large, unwieldy body. Its large membership does not facilitate effective use. The 2 meetings held each year are not adequate for proper consideration. And they recommended a number of changes, including a substantial reduction of town meeting size to possibly 30 to 100 members, as well as several other changes. They said the proposed body would be more representative of the best interests of the town as a whole than the present precinct select membership, with a smaller town meeting membership and fewer members to be elected. Brookline voters would be better able to select the town's most able citizens to serve as their representatives. In 1941, this was brought to town meeting to discuss changes. In 1942, they voted, and a very misleading headline saying town to change its government for the first time in 238 years. Obviously not true, because there had been a major change in 1915. But they did not adopt all the changes that the Public Administration Services had recommended. And as far as I can tell, it was fairly limited. And the main modification was in the way the precincts were formed, because the precincts in 1940 were exactly the same as they were in 1915. And the major change in 1942 was to make them more aligned with the population. So you can see a little bit in Precinct 9, South Brookline is split in 2. So twice as many representatives in town meeting akin with the population. In the north, there were 3 precincts, and those were split into 4. Around Coolidge Corner, 2 was split into 3, so more aligned with the population. But that didn't seem to be much more in the overall structure of town government. So how well does it work today? And this is kind of what we're asking 80 some odd years after that 1940 report. And people discussed it in 1900 and 1915 and 1940, and we're discussing it today. So what can we learn from others? Well, a better Brookline, and they're not the only ones, are in favor of Brookline becoming a city. But one of the things that I learned from Mel Kleckner's presentation in September was one, that these are places that moved from town to city recently, but that there are different kinds of city government. Newton has a traditional mayor and council, a 24-member council, and the mayor is elected, where Cambridge has a hybrid model where the city manager is appointed and there's a weak mayor and a 9-member city council. So there are a lot of differences. Brookline had a town administrator act. So we have a town administrator since 1985, but there are lots of other variations. The select board can be 3 or 5. Town meeting versus city council. In a town, different, the select board can have different responsibility depending on how it's set up. Organization and operations are different. So lots of things to think about, and I'll kind of end up with some questions to be asked as we think about the past, think about the present, and think about the future. Mel Kleckner said, exaggerating a little bit, but to make a point, that with 365 cities and towns in Massachusetts, there are 365 forms of government, because whether you're a city or a town, there's still a lot of questions to be answered about how that operates. So how are things decided and administered in Brookline today, and how could they be decided and administered, whether it's a city or a town? What is and what could be the organizational structure of Brookline's government? What is and could should be the role of volunteers on boards, committees, and commissions, and how representative is representative town government? How representative would city government be? Greer's going to talk a lot about how long it took for women to be representative involved in city government. But in the days when there were enslaved people in Brookline, they certainly were not represented. The Irish came to Brookline starting in the 1830s. There was not any one in a significant position in Brookline government from the Irish American community for 40 years. Are people of color and other different types of people represented in representative town government? What about voting and who gets voted on board, who serves on boards? We saw earlier how one of Chandler's issues was that only 20% of the voters in open town meeting can get into town hall. The percentage voting in town elections in 1940 was 40%. Today, it's usually around 15%. So how representative is representative town government? And I'm not answering these questions, but I think there's a lot of questions that can and should be asked, that have been asked in the past as Brookline considered things, and that we will want to ask as we move forward. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And thank you. I see one question in the chat about who gave the 50 people the land in the Muddy River area, and that was the authorities in Boston at the time, since Muddy River was part of Boston. So I don't know a lot about Boston government at the time, but that's who would have been deciding that.
Thank you, Ken. This is very, very helpful, very interesting, very informative, and leaves us with obviously a number of things to think about as we go forward. But I don't want to spend too much time, because I'd like to ask Greer to take on her component, which has more focus on the history of women in Brookline, which is of particular interest to the League of Women Voters, but I think to every resident, as it should be. So Greer, if you can get your slide up, there we go.
There we go.
You have the floor.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Betsy, and thank you, Ernie, especially for setting this up. And Ken, that was great, and it really is a wonderful review of how Brookline got here. And it's, the question is to ask about what happened before we go forward. And I decided to sort of fill into some of the history and to take you back in time before we go forward, is sort of a case study about women's involvement in especially Brookline in terms of governing and the questions: who votes, who gets to serve on boards, who gets to do what. So, and I just, call this the sort of the beginning of the room where it happened. So we'll see. But before 1870, only white males could vote, and white property owners and citizens could vote in America. But unbeknownst to me, I mean, I know now, but it took a while. But in 1879, the state of Massachusetts began to let women vote for school committee. And it was every woman, you had to be a citizen, you had to be over 21, and you had to own property or pay taxes, and you had to register every year. So this was the first chink in Brookline, in Massachusetts, in Brookline, to the beginning of the breaking down of all the men who were, who could vote. So this new law, which reserves the right to vote for women, and they're rejoicing. And it's not true it's desired, because actually it was a very big surprise to a lot of the women who were working for suffrage, because they really wanted a municipal or full suffrage. And so they decided to take this, and work with this and to sort of see how things happened. So women were able to start voting in the fall of 1879 in cities, because most of the town elections had been held before the 1879 school committee voting passed in April. And so this is a picture of a ballot box and women in 1888. But so the women went to their precincts, unlike towns, like in Brookline, where you voted at town meeting, you voted at precinct. And this is a view of women going to vote in Boston. Back a little bit, I sort of got interested in how women did in Brookline, if anything, before the school committee vote. And I discovered that, as we saw in Ken's talk, that the overseers of the poor had been part of Brookline's charge since the 1600s. And in 1877 and 1879, at the March meeting, 2 women were added to the overseers of the poor. And I think beginning this sort of women had more of a genteel and moderating effect and were interested in these sort of social services and children. And in 1879, they voted to have, and the Board of Selectmen were the overseers of the poor, that changed it in 1879, that there was a separate board of overseers, and 2 women were appointed, not elected. And so that in April of 79, the governor signed the bill, and and it wasn't until March 1889 that the first woman was elected to school committee. And as you can see in the March 1879 town meeting, they put the 2 women on the board of overseers of the poor, but they chose not to choose women to serve on the school committee. In Brookline, we were very lucky to have a lot of advocates for suffrage, for women's involvement. And 2 of the sort of primary people in Brookline who were also were the primary people and advocates in for abolition in Brookline. Their house on Tuxteth Street was the Underground Railroad. William Ingersoll Bowditch was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And so after abolition and after the Civil War and the whole idea of women voting, he sort of turned his sights to starting, he sponsored and ran a lot of suffrage meetings in town hall in the 1870s. He was president of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. And he wrote this book about taxation of women in Massachusetts, saying about taxation without representation, with a lot more words. And his wife, Sarah Ray Higginson Bowditch, was equally as involved in the women's suffrage. She belonged to the state suffrage, was involved in the bazaars, and was one of the original founders of the Brookline Equal Suffrage Association in 1895, and served on its board and the Mass Women's and the state board for about 10 or 15 years. And after the women were allowed to vote, so Mr. and Mrs. Bowditch wrote up a plan which has been adopted in Brookline to show every woman how she can be assessed and registered, and a plan which is simple, easy, and not expensive. And it was to help women. It was like an early League of Women Voters education, voter education, about what they could do. And it was to send to the assessors to say, I'm here, I pay taxes, I want this all to do, and I want to be registered. So they were just very involved and were really shown the way. And in July, the Boston Post reported that thus far only 14 Brookline women have registered their names as voters. And one lady, having taken the initiative without consulting her husband, found on telling him of her new action that it was contrary to his wishes. And a few hours later, she returned and they have his name crossed off the list. So it was still a very shaky time for women and sort of society to figure out what should be done. So Mrs. Bowditch was the first woman to vote when in March 1880, when town meeting came. And so she was the first woman, I think, to be registered, and she was the first woman to vote And women had to go into town meeting and have special ballots, have special names, and have special times to vote. And I found it interesting. She died in 1916. But she was in 1914, only 79 people turned out to the polls, but the oldest woman to vote was Mrs. Bowditch, and she was been the first woman to vote, and she drove to town hall in the family carriage. So this is sort of the sense of women voting, and how hard it was, and how the sort of the struggle with voting and how it was used for and against. So the bill was signed in April in 1879. And this is sort of a Massachusetts list that I found of voters. 334 women registered, but only 2291 voted in 79. In 1880, there was a lot more registered, but fewer people voted. And again, it sort of continued to sort of go down. And one of the provisions until 1882 was that women had to continually re-register every year. In 1882, only under 3,000 women and only 1,346 voted. And in some respects, the anti-suffragists used these statistics to say, well, women don't really want to vote anyway, so why are we bothering? And in a lot of ways, it said that, it's not a full suffrage and it's hard to engage. So this is, the checklist was used, and this is the 1873 town hall that was sort of just built in time for the town meeting, and a town meeting of 1904, that women would go in at a specific time when town meeting was voting for election for officers. And in 1880, Mr. Bowditch proffered the idea that women should be able to hold office and vote in other town affairs except for the school committee, as he kept repeating this and worked, advocate and worked tirelessly until his death in the early 1900s. And it was decided in the negative. And the effect of women voting was sort of interesting to see throughout the town. In one town, there was no tobacco smoke in the hall, and the horrors are supposed to attend a general caucus were nowhere to be seen. Gentlemen came with their lives and sat with them, and so far as I know, voted in unison. And all the balloting was over, they went together and returned to their homes as peaceably as they have. And several ladies said they wouldn't have missed it for anything. And in Barnstable, only 2 ladies voted, but 3 cheers were given for them as they dropped their votes in the ballot box. And in Westfield, smoking was prohibited while the ladies were in the hall. As far as I can learn, not an ungentlemanly remark or discourteous word was offered in their presence. Thus, a new era has successfully inaugurated in Westfield and promised with happy results. So it's that women, have this mitigating and civilizing effect on society is why they were being able to vote for the school committee. But it also sort of, some people affected this. But not everybody was as happy to have the women voters. There was a report from Scituate saying, one lady said, they told me when I reached the door that they were not voting just then for the school committee, and they wouldn't for some time. And when she went back, they said they'd already got past it and voted, so she should go away. So it sort of was an interesting shuffle about how women were voting and how they were perceived and how they kind of had to weave their way into it and the barriers put up to them. So there's an article in the paper from 1902 that that sort of really called out women's voting, which I found very interesting because of the 2 women that are mentioned, that women didn't appear in numbers until the afternoon, but they began to arrive in 2s and 3s. And during the hour 1 or 2, they were numerous. And in fact, they were almost in the majority in the hall. Those of them who needed instructions as to mark their ballots were attended to by Mrs. G.H. Page, Mary Hutchinson Page, who was the founder of the Brookline Equal Suffrage Association, as well as the Boston Equal Suffrage Association for Good Government, and was involved in the state and worked tirelessly nationally to get suffrage passed. And so she really, again, her own League of Women Voters in a way. And they also called out one other voter, who was Florida Ruffin Ridley, who was another suffragist, anti-lynching advocate, prominent journalist, and with her mother founded the Women's Era Club and the Women's Era paper. And she voted as well. So, you know, I just found it interesting about calling out these two sort of important women. And Florida Ruffin Ridley School is the new name of the Coolidge Corner School. So this went on about sort of the push me, pull me, and just the only being able to really vote for school committee until August 18th, 1920, when finally all the work that Page and Ridley and Bowditch, the Bowditches had done over the years, a federal amendment was passed and it became legal in August 18, 1920 to allow women the possibility of voting. And so that year, in 1920, women also, not only did they want to vote in municipal elections, they also wanted to hold office and run. And the women, they proposed it to town meeting to be able to change the acts that made Brookline a town representative town meeting in 1915 to strike out the word male, so women could not only vote, but they could also run and hold office for local positions. But the the town meeting decided to pass on it and didn't take any action. So the women who were involved and who wanted this to happen contacted their legislators, and they pushed and pushed. And so finally, on December 13, Chapter 632, Acts of 1920, at a special session, they deleted the word male from the 1915 Act, and allowing women to run and hold offices in Brookline. And in December December 13th, Governor Coolidge signed it and gave one of the quills with which he signed it to the Brookline League of Women Voters. And in December 17th, it became a statewide mandate enabling all women to hold municipal office. So 5 women ran in March 1921 for town meeting, and 4 women win, all but Miss Marion E. O'Brien. And I was, amused to find out that there was a recount, because she sort of wasn't sure that was right. But these 4 women, Mae Johnson, Helen Whittington, Margaret Robinson, and Sybil Holmes, had all been involved pretty much with suffrage. And in 1920, when Brookline became the League of Women Voters, Mrs. Whittington was the chair, and a year or two later, Sybil Holmes was the chair. And in 1922, Mrs. Whittington, Helen Whittington, ran for the nomination of selectman. And in 1924, 23 and 24, Sybil Holmes ran, and neither of them were elected, and both had been president of the League. And it wasn't until 1960 in March that the first woman was elected, Louise Castle, who was also a former president of the Brookline League of Voters, retiring in 1969. But if you look on the left, you can sort of still see the attitude of sort of popular culture and society about women running in office or being elected. And the feminine touch enters voting in Brookline. And she had just won election. It was politics is her dish, and showing her loading the dishwasher. So on the right is a picture of this formidable and very astute woman at the dedication of the new town hall in 1965 with the other selectmen and Mayor Collins. And she remained active after she retired, and even became a vice president of the Metropolitan Planning Association. And just 4 years ago, town meeting voted to remove selectmen from its name to select board, being quite a long time that women had been involved in town government. And so this has been a case study to show the many aspects of changing local government and how social and cultural perceptions are important. And it chronicles the not so straight and glorious path towards inclusion. It also reflects many of the issues that Ken raised and issues we need to consider to ensure that we have a government that reflects the whole community. And women were the start, but we still need to work away at it. So there you go.
Wow. Well, thank you, Greer. And I'm glad you were able to end at least on a woman being elected to a member of what is now the select board.
Right. And I should say that it took a while to have more, but we've had quite a few, including the Gus president.
There have been several since, thank goodness.
And chair and being chair as Mrs. Castle was a chair as well. Right.
So at least we were starting a new tradition, which has been continuing. Anyway, there's a lot to think about here, and I'm just looking at the chat, and I find there is a question, which I think probably is directed toward Ken. I wonder if there are statistics about increase, decrease in voter participation in towns where they've made a change from town meeting to a mayor or town council.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I started to look into that and did not quite get far enough to find out. It's a little bit hard. One of the things that I did is I looked at several other towns and their participation rate in town elections, because one of the questions I had, which is a little bit of a different question, is, is Brookline different? We have a lot of people who come and go, who work at the hospitals and universities, and does that affect it? But when I started to look at places that have become cities, it became harder, in part because city elections are generally held in November on the same day as state and federal elections. So it's not a valid comparison, because people are coming out to vote for governor and mayor and senator and representative and president at the same time they're voting in the city government. So I suspect there are some social scientists out there and political scientists who have found ways to measure this, but I thought I could do it myself and found that it was not an easy question to answer because of the different time of when they vote, because town elections are not held at the same time as the national and state elections.
And that actually is a very good explanation for why turnout is greater at those particular times. Doesn't properly explain why Brookline's turnout is as low as it is.
Yeah, and when I did look at several other towns, it varied. There were some where Brookline was better, some were worse, and it varied from year to year. There are times when there was one town, I can't remember which one, that one year had 40% voting, and another year had 12%. And so sometimes they're issue driven that bring out certain things too. So
and I would even argue when there's a controversial issue and you've got candidates representing different perspectives, that definitely raises the turnout. So it probably varies depending on the individual conditions. I'm going to say thank you very much to Ken and to Greer. This has been very interesting and I think stimulating, and I hope is a very good, I feel personally is a very good, and I hope others agree, kickoffs. So as we go forward, we will do more investigations. We will try to give people answers. We'll try to come up with information that will be valuable and help people in decision-making, which is really where we hope this will all lead. Because clearly there are going to be some issues coming forward, some of which will be rather controversial, I suspect. So thanks again to our speakers for helping us understand where we've been and helping us to think about where we're going. I also want to specifically thank Ernie Fry, who's been supplying our Zoom. And I want to thank all our league members who work to make this kind of event possible. We work together, and it's very important to be part of this team. So thank you to all, and to all, good night.